our CEO. RNAO is the professional association for registered nurses, nurse practitioners, and nursing students in Ontario. Since 1925, RNAO has advocated for healthy public policy, promoted excellence in nursing practice, and increased nurses' contribution to shaping the health system. Tonight, we are joined by the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, CAPE, National Board Member Dr. Samantha Green, and Chair of CAPE, Dr. Millie Roy. CAPE is a nonprofit organization that takes action to enable health for all by engaging with governments, running campaigns, conducting research, and drawing media attention to key issues. They support physicians to be advocates for healthier environments and ecosystems. Our two organizations came together to plan an all-party debate this month that focuses on health and justice in climate emergency. As we all know, the environment plays a critical role in our lives, and now is a crucial time to conserve and protect it. With temperatures rising faster in Ontario than the global average and human activity driving climate change with increasing greenhouse gas emissions, we must do all we can to ensure the environment is healthy for future generations. Thank you to everyone who has joined our debate, including members of our board of directors, our assembly of leaders, other RNAO members, and reporters. We'd also like to especially thank RNAO's Ontario Nurses for the Environment Interest Group for their support and continued advocacy on the environmental determinants of health. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the traditional land on which RNAO resides. We recognize that our work and the work of our members takes place on traditional Indigenous territories across Ontario. We also wish to acknowledge that the RNAO office is located on the traditional land and unceded territory of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, this land is still the home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this territory. By personally making a land acknowledgement, you are taking part in an act of reconciliation, honoring the land and Indigenous heritage, which dates back over 10,000 years. We encourage you to learn about the land you reside on and the treaties that are attached to it. Land acknowledgements are an act of reconciliation, and we must all do our part. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight, Dr. Dan Riskin. Dan is a biologist and science journalist, best known as the former co-host of Daily Planet on the Discovery Channel. He has hosted TV documentaries about science for various stations, including the Discovery Channel, Animal Planet, National Geographic, CBC, and CTV, and he appears regularly on the news across Canada, making science as accessible and engaging as possible. Dan's first book, Mother Nature is Trying to Kill You, was a Canadian bestseller, and his first picture book for kids, Fiona the Fruit Bat, will come out this fall. Thank you for joining us this evening, Dan.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Doris. Thank you, Samantha. Thank you, Millie, for the opportunity to moderate this important debate. I'm very excited to get going here. So let me jump into it. According to a recent CBC poll, roughly a third of Ontarians say that climate change is their top worry. Now, that might surprise you, right? Only a third? It doesn't sound like very much. But here's the thing about issues. Ontarians can care about more than one thing at a time. For example, it's possible for someone in Ontario to care about the economy and climate change at the same time. And besides that, the issues overlap, right? You take the example that we all learned harshly from COVID-19. Fundamentally, that is a symptom of environmental degradation. Disease ecologists have warned for decades that when you take away habitat from animals, it increases the rates of diseases jumping from animals to humans. With COVID-19, we saw that happen, but then all of a sudden it wasn't just an environmental problem, it was a global health crisis. And it hit different communities in different ways around the world. And so it was very clear that it was connected to social justice. Ontarians can care about the environment and healthcare and social justice all at once because they have to. Those things are all connected. Today's debate is about climate change. And it's clear that whichever party is next elected to govern Ontario is going to have to address that issue. The purpose of today's debate is to give representatives from Ontario's major political parties the opportunity to share their climate change policies with voters and to lay out the health and social justice components of those climate policies. I want to thank our participants for joining us tonight. Peter Tabbins is the climate and energy critic for the Ontario NDP. Dr. Katie Gibbs is the Liberal candidate for the provincial riding of Ottawa Centre. And Dr. Diane Sachs is the deputy leader of the Ontario Green Party. Our team invited the Progressive Conservative Party to send a representative to participate, but unfortunately they did not accept. Before I invite our panelists to tell us a bit more about themselves, I want to let everyone know how this evening is going to unfold. I'm going to ask the panelists 4 questions. They're each going to have the opportunity to provide responses no longer than 2 minutes. And for 2 of those questions, 2 of the 4, I'm going to provide an opportunity for a rebuttal, which will also be 2 minutes. And then things get interesting, because we're going to crowdsource issues and questions from you, the audience. So I invite all of you watching the debate to send your questions and concerns through the chat function. We'll be keeping an eye on that. I won't be watching the chat in real time, but our team will be, and they're going to help me gather representative questions that come up there. But in addition to the questions we get in the chat, we're also going to be using something called Mentimeter to poll you in the audience about what matters to you. And just to show you what I mean, we're going to start a practice run on Mentimeter right now. So Anne-Marie is going to post a link in the chat. Should be coming up any moment here. And you should click on that link and you can tell us a little bit about yourself. You can tell us your role in your family. There's the link. Maybe your role in the family or where you live or what you do for a living, whatever you want to tell us about yourself, just tell us something so that we get a glimpse of who's in the audience. And the software is going to help us see all of your answers at one time. So go ahead, or you can just go to menti.com and use that code that's at the top of your screen. All right, so we're starting to see some words come in. So we've got, here we go, there it is. See, the magic is happening. As you add words, they start to come together. This is really interesting. So I'm seeing environmentalist, I'm seeing mother front and center. That's a word. If it's a bigger word and it's more central, that means it's come up for several people. So we're seeing nurse, we're seeing environmentalist, we're seeing nurse practitioner, worried, some emotional words in there. They move too much. Christian, female, Ottawa, Treaty 13 was the first word to jump up. Social justice, Ottawa, hate, injustice. Yeah, I hear you there. Great. So we've got a little glimpse. So Peter, Katie, Diane, now that we know who's here watching and listening this evening, let's give you a chance to tell us a bit more about yourselves. I'll give you 1 minute to just briefly introduce yourself. And Peter, I'm going to let you start first. And before I start your timer, my plan is if you've hit 2 minutes or you've hit your time, I'll sort of wave a piece of paper to try to get your attention. And if you keep going, then I'll start being rude and cutting you off. And ultimately, we do have a mute button, so don't get too carried away. But Peter, please go ahead and introduce yourself in 1 minute.
Dan, thanks, and thanks to RNAO and Kate for hosting this evening's debate. I've worked on health and environmental issues for many years, and I can say on behalf of myself and the Ontario NDP, we've always understood the strong link between environment and health. In fact, we've recently introduced a bill in the legislature to start to prepare our healthcare system for the challenges that the climate crisis will be bringing to us. In the 90s, I was chair of the Board of Health here in the city of Toronto, and I pioneered smoke-free bars and restaurants. And at the same time, I initiated the city's energy conservation program for commercial buildings, a really strong climate protection move. I've been a government relations person for the Ontario Nurses Association and also head of Greenpeace Canada. I was the climate advisor to federal NDP leader Jack Layton, and I'm currently, as you noted, the critic for energy in the climate crisis for the Ontario NDP. It was the Ontario NDP that created the position of Environmental Commissioner and set up our Environmental Bill of Rights. Currently, I'm very proud to work with strong environmentalists in my caucus like Jessica Bell, Joel Harden, and Butila Carpaccio. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Peter. That's great. Katie, go ahead.
Sure. Well, again, thank you so much to RNAO and CAPE for hosting this debate and having me. There's no doubt that the climate emergency is the defining crisis of our times, and it impacts every other issue, like you mentioned, Dan, So I think it's so essential that it is one of the main things that we discuss going into the election. And so a big thank you to you all for hosting this today and helping to get that discussion going. This is a big reason why I'm running for office. My background is in science, and I have 2 young kids whose future I'm very concerned about. And I think we need more elected officials who truly understand the urgency and the scale of this crisis, and who are going to put addressing the climate crisis at the core of every decision the government makes. So the Ontario Liberals have an ambitious yet feasible plan to reduce our emissions and grow a clean economy for all Ontarians. And I'm looking forward to sharing it with you today. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie. And Diane, I'll let you go ahead.
Yes, hi. I was the last environmental commissioner of Ontario. It's part of my 46 years of fighting for the public interest and fighting for a healthy environment. I'm a mother and a grandmother, and I picked the Green Party when I had to decide who to run for, because it's the only one that's serious about climate and environment. I mean, how do you feel about the NDP, the Liberals, and Ford sending car owners a pre-election check? Instead of gimmicks, Mike Schreiner and the Greens stand for real action on what matters most, and I'm here to earn your vote, not to buy it. We have an honest, bold roadmap for action that starts now, and we've shown what it will cost and how to pay for it. Ontario has really serious work to do, but also enormous benefits to gain. Pulling together to win in the new climate economy can mean 800,000 new careers and keeping billions of dollars in Ontario. It's too late for tweaks and half measures. The old line parties have had lots of time, but they don't get the job done. For real change, you need more Green MPPs at Queen's Park. And that's why I'm here today.
Thank you. Great. And you have all set a great precedent of not going crazy over time. And I thank you for that, and thank you in advance for continuing that trend. All right, I want to start a discussion tonight with the obvious. What are your party's greenhouse gas targets? How much are you prepared to spend on reaching those targets? And what's the strategy? What's your party's big idea to get that done? I'm going to start with you, Katie, and then I'm going to go to Diane and then Peter. Katie, you have 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you. I will say that part of the challenge is that our full climate platform has not been released yet. It is coming out soon, so I can't really get into all of the details today, but I can certainly give you some of the themes. So of course, we are going to commit to getting to net zero by 2050, and we will have an ambitious 2030 target as well. And it's not enough at this point to have an ambitious target or a goal. You need to have a detailed plan for how you're going to get there. And we do have a detailed plan for how we're going to cut emissions, grow the clean economy, and bring green jobs to Ontario. The plan is costed. It's also modeled. The emission reductions are modeled. I can tell you that one of the things that's in the plan is that we're also going to have some mechanisms in there that are going to make government more transparent and accountable to Ontarians on how we are doing and actually reaching those goals and how we're making progress towards those emissions reductions. We really need to show that and be showing it every year up until 2030, not just there, to make sure that we're actually getting towards our ambitious goal. The plan is going to center around a few themes. One of them is obviously going to be growing that clean economy, bringing green jobs here. We're going to be, putting taxes and fees on the large polluters while also supporting research and commercialization for other new technologies, cleaner businesses. We need to keep our electricity system one of the cleanest in the world. Currently is very clean. We need to keep it that way. We need to look at changing how we move people and goods, electrifying transportation, while also making big investments into public transit and active transportation infrastructure as well. We're going to have a big focus on nature-based solutions. We have already committed to protecting 30% of the area in Ontario as protected areas, which is huge. And the last component is going to be around buildings, making sure that we have high efficiency buildings for Ontarians through retrofits and updating the building code. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie. Diane.
Right. Well, thank you, Katie. And I would certainly have studied your plan if there was one. Net zero, we hear a lot of talk about net zero by 2050, but net zero by 2050 isn't enough to keep us a stable climate. And especially if the net includes unreliable things like planting trees. Our plan has three key elements that we haven't seen in any other party. The first is that we look at the total amount of climate pollution that Ontario is going to release for the rest of the century. We need to have a fair share carbon budget for the rest of the century and to be at real zero by 2045. And our plan does. The second thing we need in order to achieve that is a serious carbon fee. There is a federal carbon fee right now, but it doesn't go up even by 2030 high enough to make it economic for people to switch away from, for example, heating their houses with gas. We need to have a higher carbon price. And of course, under our plan, it results in a dividend back to families, an equal dividend to all families, which leaves most Ontarians better off. The third critical element after a serious carbon budget and a serious carbon fee is to double our electricity system. That's the only way we're going to be able to stop wasting $16 to $25 billion every year importing fossil fuels, which we do in Ontario. That's $1 trillion over a generation, and all that leaves behind is pollution. We don't need to do any of that. We can cut energy waste and double our electricity supply with renewables and storage and swaps with Quebec. We've done a very detailed model of the electricity system of Ontario. We've shown how we can do it. It'll keep electricity prices the same, but it will clean the air. It will create a huge number of jobs here in Ontario. It will insulate us from these crazy swings that we see in the world market when Putin invades Ukraine or whatever else happens. And it gives us a degree of protection and security and independence as we go forward. Okay. The net cost would be about 8% of the provincial budget. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Peter, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much. That's a pretty extensive question, Dan. So targets, first off, our 2030 target is a 50% reduction from 2005, so about 100 megatons, which is, I think, the same as the Greens have planned. For 2050, net zero, and I think that that's the least. We hope we can go further than that and faster than that. When it comes to actual implementation, a few things: taking our electricity system to zero by 2030. Diane's quite correct. We're looking at an increase in emissions, and I think we're in a position to actually go to zero with that system in a way that's really beneficial to both the environment and the economy. Buildings, I think, are pretty critical. We're committed to retrofitting 5% of the buildings in Ontario every year, starting the year after the election takes place, as a way of dramatically cutting both greenhouse gas emissions, but also reducing the need for investment in electricity. There's no doubt about it that it's far more cost effective to invest in people's homes and businesses than to be building new transmission lines. So that's, for us, a pretty critical thing. When it comes to transportation, electrifying our transit systems and expanding our transit systems by investing in them with provincial funds, that's going to be extraordinarily important, as well as making investments in active transportation so that people can walk and cycle and get to the destinations they have to get to without generating any greenhouse gases. In terms of carbon pricing, going back to a cap and trade system, using it both to generate funds for investment in climate action, but also incentives for businesses and individuals to reduce their carbon emissions. What I'd like to add is that we see this as a huge opportunity for social justice and equity, that there's an opportunity through creation of hundreds of thousands of jobs in building retrofits and in other areas to bring on a much larger workforce and expand opportunities for women and other marginalized groups. Dan, I can see your paper. I take the hint. Thank you.
Great. Good. I'm glad I picked a visible sheet. I was worried it wouldn't be visible. I had one that looked like a bunch of books behind me, and that clearly wouldn't have been the right one to use. All right, so let's have a little bit of a rebuttal here. So Katie, I'm going to give you the first opportunity to respond to what you've heard, and then we'll hear from Diane and then Peter. Katie, you have 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Sure. Let me just start my timer. I wasn't prepared for this one to be a rebuttal one. Well, I heard the glib comments there about, if our plan was out. I can assure you we do have an incredibly thorough plan coming out. We did an immense consultation period. We, talked to many organizations. We, hundreds of thousands of Ontarians participated in our consultation. As I mentioned, the plan is not only costed, but modeled. That takes time. We want to get it right. So the plan is going to be coming soon, and I can't wait for everyone to get to see the details. But, realistically, we are all in on climate action, and we're looking at, how ambitious can we possibly be while still making sure that it's feasible? Because at this point, the last thing we need are targets and goals that can't be met. And so we want to look at by 2030, which is 8 years away. It's a short timeline. We want to have a really detailed plan that we can implement from day one. And so that is really what we're focused on. And, I already mentioned a lot of what's in there. And I think it is, similar to what we're hearing from the Greens and the NDP. We have to keep our electricity system non-emitting. We need to electrify transportation. We need to reduce emissions from buildings. And of course, a huge part of that is protecting the natural areas that we have in Ontario. Not only are these places that are so important for Ontarians, but also they are huge carbon sinks. And so we need to protect these areas from development. And that is something that we have already committed to. Protecting 30% of Ontario is not a small feat. That's a huge commitment that will go a long way. And, we're going to be looking in consultation with Ontarians and especially with Indigenous communities to help figure out where do we actually want to have those new protected areas. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie. Diane, 2 minutes to rebut.
Right. Well, Katie, your leader never talks about climate. Maybe there is going to be a plan, but we can't know because we can't see it. What we do know is that any serious climate commitment is inconsistent with the way your party voted and Peter's party voted last month to allow Ford to send back these car license checks, which makes driving cheaper, which is exactly the contrary to the direction that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us we must go, and takes away money from public services, which are urgently needed, which money we would spend on funding mental health. What we have to do is look at the way parties behave, not just what they say they're going to do in a plan we haven't seen. And both the Liberals and the NDP voted, for example, for keeping Line 5 running, which is an oil pipeline that's a ticking time bomb under the Great Lakes and has leaked at least 33 times that we know of, although not in that exact location yet. Really what it comes down to is action, I think, speaks louder than words. In terms of protecting 30% of Ontario, every percent of Ontario is 1 million hectares. The only way we're going to be able to protect anything like that kind of area is to do what we have done and pledge $1 billion for Indigenous climate leadership and to respect Indigenous protected and conserved areas in priority to mining and logging. No other party has done that. In terms of Peter's comment about cap and trade, listen, I was the biggest booster of cap and trade when I was commissioner. It was a good system for Ontario, but we've left it behind. The most disruptive thing we can do to climate action is to keep changing systems, and changing back to cap and trade now would, again, upset the apple cart, defer further investments, and make it less clear to business what to do. And on top of that, the cap and trade prices are way too low. It's about $20 a ton already today lower in the cap and trade system. So too much disruption, not enough money to get things done. And I had lots of other things to say, but thank you, Dan.
And I appreciate you're not saying them and sticking to time. Peter, go right ahead. 2 minutes, please.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. I just want to address this question of the car license checks that was referenced by Diane. Diane, as you're aware, what was before us was an omnibus bill, and we were very shocked that the Greens voted against an initiative to put more child welfare in the hands of Indigenous people, something that they very much wanted. As you're well aware, the Tories are very adept at mixing a variety of issues into a bill. And so for you to vote against First Nations communities and their concerns about children was quite a shock for us. I want to go to Katie. Katie, you're in a very difficult position, and I've been in it before, where you're in a place where you have to defend a policy that has not yet been made public. So I got to cut you some slack on that. But I will say that I was very frustrated in dealing with the Liberals in the past on their climate policy, not only because I didn't see the models or the programs coming forward that would actually meet the targets, and that's a critical factor, but also a failure to be transparent about the expected impact of investments that were made. That was a huge difficulty for us. We couldn't see how you could meet your targets, and we couldn't actually find out, nor could the auditor or the financial accountability officer, exactly what you expected to get from the investments that you made. So I'm interested in seeing what plan you bring forward, but your history on this is one that's quite checkered, and that is indeed a problem. I want to say as well, in terms of the electricity system, that it is going to be critical to get to net zero. We need to take the natural gas out of the system and go to a zero system so that we can, in fact, decarbonize very broadly with electricity. But I think if people focus too much on transmission lines and on generation, instead of actually investing in conservation and buildings, we'll have a far more expensive system than we want. Dan, thank you.
Thank you. Great. Okay, let's move on to my next question. Before I do that, though, I just want to remind people watching this debate that we're looking for topics for questions that come later. And a great way for you to put ideas into our heads is through the chat function. My team is monitoring that, and I see that there are things coming in there already. But your voice matters. This is ultimately, you're who these people are speaking to. So please do, if there's something you want to hear about, put it in the chat so that we can get to it. Question 2. All right, let's get into the connectedness of these different issues. The cost of housing is a major point of stress for a lot of people in Ontario, especially in the GTA. And one consequence of that trend is an increase in urban sprawl, which in turn influences everything from habitat for endangered species to the availability of farmland for food security to transportation and transit. So does your party have plans to address sprawl specifically? If so, what are they? And if not, why not? This time we'll go Diane and then Peter and Katie. Diane, go ahead. You have 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Dan. In my very last full report to the Ontario Legislature, just 2 days before my office was abolished, I documented how sprawl is Ontario's oil songs. It's our worst source of environmental destruction and climate impacts. It causes the worst congestion in North America, worse than Los Angeles, worse than New York City. It puts families into a very high cost environment with high municipal taxes, high transportation costs. It traps them in exhausting, expensive, soul crushing commutes. And I lived that life for a number of years. You drag yourself off the highway too late and too tired for any good time with my kids. Plus, of course, environmental destruction and flooding. So in our plan, it's absolutely critical that we stop sprawl. No more urban boundary expansions, period. No more destructive highways like the Bradford bypass that the Liberals are supporting, or 413. We would stop the subsidies for sprawl. There is lots of room within existing urban boundaries for great communities for all the housing that we need, starting with parking lots. I mean, one study that I reviewed when I was commissioner showed there was room for 450,000 people in Mississauga alone just on parking lots near transit. And in addition, you add to that being flexible in terms of backyard houses, subdivisions, triplexes, quadruplexes, fourth floor walk-ups, backyards, tiny houses, condos, co-ops. We have so many opportunities to bring the cost of housing down, to bring a denser population in areas, many of whom are losing population, and it would be a better quality of life and more fair. The only reason we're building sprawl is that developers make a lot of money that way. And that's the direction we're being dragged in. Locks us into a terrible future.
Thank you very much. Peter, I'll let you go next.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dan. Diane's made a good point here, and that's that a lot of what drives sprawl has nothing to do with actual housing need. It has to do with speculators making dollars. Highway 413 is a prime example. This is a highway being built to make a fortune for speculators and not actually to solve a transportation problem. So we think that building these kinds of highways, including the Bradford bypass, are a mistake. They lead to sprawl, higher costs, and environmental degradation. So that, when you think about this, Dan, don't just think that sprawl is driven by need. It's driven by profit, and profit for speculators and developers. We agree that cities should be kept within their urban boundaries. Hamilton recently had a referendum on this. They didn't want to expand beyond their boundaries. They got beat up by the provincial government over it, but they were right. And that's something that we need. We can expand within our boundaries. There's been an ongoing fight in Toronto now for years about the ability of people in suburban areas to put basement units or second units in their homes, something that would increase density with very low extra costs. I think that we need to go there. That's something that would actually make things a lot easier, a lot quicker. But I have to say, you've touched on housing policy, and I think there are some things around rent control that are going to be absolutely necessary to reduce the political drive to justify sprawl. If we don't end vacancy decontrol, if we end vacancy decontrol and we put in some real controls on the amount that landlords can crank things up, then you reduce that political pressure to support this destructive sprawl. And I think we need to build a lot more non-market housing, which is part of our housing platform, to make sure that the need is met, and again, reduce political support for sprawl. I think that if we are serious about dealing with sprawl, that densification within the cities, the building of transit to serve denser areas is going to be critical to winning on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. And Katie, I'll give you 2 minutes starting now.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's no doubt that how we build our communities has a huge impact on our emissions, and we need to look at where we're building, how we're building, and how both of those factors impact with transit. One of the most damaging things the Ford government has done has been using ministerial zoning orders to rezone land without any public or environmental consultation. They've used this like 60 times, I think, in the past 4 years. We have said that we will scrap using MZOs and replace them with a new rules-based measure that is only to be used in a very handful of situations. Like others have said, the reality, though, is that we do have a growing population and a housing crisis. So there's no question that we need to build more homes, but we absolutely need to build them in a smart way in existing built areas, not by expanding the urban boundary. When we expand it, we not only do we end up locking people into long commutes that require new highways, but we're also eating up natural land and natural habitat that makes those communities actually less resilient to feeling the effects of climate. I did my PhD on endangered species, and one of my jobs was looking up what were the main threats to endangered species in Canada. And one of the most common ones, again and again, was habitat loss due to new housing development, again and again and again. So it absolutely is a huge cause of our ecosystem destruction in Ontario. So our plan absolutely involves looking at how we can use land use planning as one of the many tools to address the climate crisis, to focus on how we can build complete communities that don't require relying on cars as much for trips. And our plan is also going to have a record investment in public transit and dedicated funding for active transportation as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Great. I'm going to move on to my third question, and I'll give you a warning this time. This is a question for which there will be a rebuttal. So let's do this. We're coming up on almost a year since Lytton, British Columbia hit a temperature of 49.6 degrees Celsius. It's almost 5 degrees hotter than the previous Canadian temperature record. In this same summer, extreme heat killed at least 595 people in British Columbia. And we have not seen numbers like that in Ontario, but you do feel a little bit like you're sitting at home while your neighbor's house is on fire. So what do you think the climate-related dangers are for people here in Ontario, and how do you propose to protect our health system specifically? I'm going to go Peter, and then Katie, and then Diane for this one. Peter, you have 2 minutes, please.
Great. Thanks very much, Dan. I guess there are a few things here. First of all, I would say in the very big picture, we actually have to sit down and think through how our healthcare system is going to have to be reshaped. for the future that we're heading into at a very rapid rate. We're going to have to deal with more injury from extreme weather events like flooding, fire. We are going to have to deal with new diseases or expanded range of diseases like Lyme that we've had less to deal with in the past, and we're probably going to have to deal with more tropical diseases. So I think that for Ontario, the first step is sitting down and saying, what's coming at us? How does the healthcare system have to be structured to do that? The climate dangers that I think that we're facing are going to be, as I said before, flooding, and particularly as people are aware with the changes that the Ford government brought about with the conservation authorities, reducing the ability to block housing from being built on floodplains. So that's an area where they are putting people in peril. We obviously would put power back into the hands of conservation authorities and stop building on floodplains. Fire, particularly wildfires in forested areas, is going to be a huge issue. And I think there are two elements there. One, you have to assess the threat to each community that is in a wildfire area and make sure that you take every step you can to reduce their risk, make sure that they have exits. But I also think that you have to look at what measures can we do in forested areas to reduce the risk of fires there, to the extent that you can. Frankly, let's face it, when the world's made an awful lot hotter, there are factors that are going to be a problem beyond our control. And I would say that when it comes to disease, we're just going to have a population that understands more effectively what the threats are and be prepared to take them on.
Thank you. Katie, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. It's an important question, and I wish we spent more time talking about the health impacts of the climate crisis. I think there's so many ways where they overlap, and it's pretty scary, frankly. But I think that fortunately, there are so many examples of where the actions that will help reduce our emissions are also ones that will help protect people's health and make our communities more resilient to the changes in climate that we are going to face. Air quality is a huge one. You know, the reality is that beyond the effects of heating up the planet, burning fossil fuels is also a huge source of air pollution that leads to many health impacts, asthma, the obvious one, but also many more. So hopefully, as we work on moving our vehicles to EVs and stopping that fossil fuel consumption, we will have less air quality issues. You know, you mentioned the heat waves, and this is one that I think about a lot as someone who lives in a very urban environment where heat waves do tend to be deadly. And this is where we need to get smart about the solution. So a perfect example of this is heat pumps. So even in Ottawa with our winters, you know, we can convert homes here to use a heat pump that uses electricity for heating. But the great thing about heat pumps is that they also do cooling. And so let's start thinking about who are those in our community who are most vulnerable to the effects of heat. And let's make sure that we're prioritizing them for transitioning to heat pumps, which will work for both their heating and then also make sure that they have a cooling option. And the same thing goes for trees. You know, we know that planting trees is one of the things that we need to do, but not only does it have positive effects on our emissions, but we know that those trees are also going to help us with the urban heat island effect and help keep our cities cooler as the climate does change. And that will end up being life-saving when we experience, you know, a heat dome here at some point.
Thank you very much. Diane, go ahead, please.
Think about going third, right? We know, as both of them have said, physical health is already getting clobbered by climate change, but no one has mentioned mental health. The latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change really emphasized that mental health is already getting clobbered, especially for the young, and they're right to be angry and afraid and depressed about the fires and the floods and the storms and the heat and the pandemics and the Lyme disease to make it dangerous to go out in the woods and all those things. And for the healthcare system itself, it's also getting clobbered and being expected to pick up all the pieces, even though 80% of health outcomes are determined by environment, inadequate housing, and poverty. And they're all getting worse right now. So our top health priority is prevention. We would set a living wage. We would double the ODSP in Ontario Works so that people actually can have enough money to live a dignified life and buy decent quality food. We would build 160,000 affordable housing units. We would put decent funding for mental health, because mental health is health, and it has been dramatically underfunded and stigmatized for many years. And of course, we have a thorough climate and environment plan, much more ambitious than anybody else, to dramatically reduce our emissions. And it also includes dedicated funding, a dedicated levy and dedicated funding, $2 billion a year for adaptation, and with particular attention to the most vulnerable who are going to need it. Interestingly enough, the World Health Organization has repeatedly reported that whatever it costs us to get off fossil fuels, we'll save twice as much in the health benefits. And so that's another reason why getting on with climate action now can have immediate benefits for us right here in cleaner air and better health. You know, doctors are always telling us the single most powerful prescription they could ever give is for people to be physically active outside. And if we do as our plan calls for and convert a huge amount of road space so that people can walk and cycle to where they need to go, we're going to have all of those benefits. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. And as I said earlier, this is a question for which there are rebuttals, and we'll use the same order. So Peter, please go ahead for 2 minutes. Rebuttal, please.
Thanks, Dan. First of all, I agree with an awful lot of what my colleagues have said. And Dan, to give us 2 minutes to talk about this, I know you have to, but man, all three of us could go on for a lot more. My colleagues raised a number of issues that I just want to touch on. Kate is quite right. An overlap exists between a climate solution and a health solution. We have a severe problem with air pollution. It gets worse the more fossil fuels that we burn. I would say that one of the opportunities that we have in taking on the climate crisis is when we retrofit our houses, when we retrofit our businesses, we have an opportunity to put in ventilation systems that will deal with airborne pathogens like COVID. We shouldn't miss that opportunity. We should take it. We should seize it. Diane's quite correct. Mental health is a huge problem with climate change. People were very depressed going through the heart of COVID. Many people are feeling the depression now, understanding the kind of future they're going to have in a climate damaged world. Prevention is obviously the key thing. Mitigating is obviously the key thing. But I also have to note the NDP came out with its mental health plan in the last few weeks, because we know that mental health is a huge issue, one that was huge aside from all the impacts of climate, but is going to be worsened by climate. I wanted to note one other thing here. Yes, investing in housing, it came up before when we were talking about sprawl. And I think we need to talk about it here as well. To the extent that people have high quality housing that's well insulated so that they don't have the impact of extreme heat and extreme cold, you have people that are able to be more resilient in dealing with the challenges that are coming at them. Dan, thanks.
Thank you very much. Katie, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Don't really have anything to disagree with, but lots to add. I think the mental health thing is huge. Climate anxiety is, I'm technically a millennial, and I think for people my age and younger, we've had this existential threat pretty much as long as we can remember. And so, I think pretty much everyone has climate anxiety. And so it also interacts, like Diane said, with mental health. Our platform also is going to have some things addressing mental health. We have already announced as well that we're going to be adopting a living wage and making it easier for people to access mental health benefits as well. So, those are key. And, Peter brought up the air quality, and another element of that I've been thinking about during these COVID times as we think about ventilation is how much that's also going to be a factor with smoke from wildfires as well. Even last summer, the smoke did make it all the way from Western Canada to Ottawa, even some days. We had a few air quality alerts. And so I think that's where these things are so connected. And if we can, focus on building higher performance, higher quality buildings, that are more insulated to help stop that heat and cooling loss, to make them, use less energy. It also makes them better sealed for having, less issues with air pollution and potential smoke coming in. And if they have proper HVAC systems, that helps address disease vectors like COVID, but it also helps clean the air from things like pollution from wildfires. So really, these issues are so connected, and I think these are some of the perfect examples of why. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Diane, please go ahead.
Again, my colleagues are saying things that largely I agree with. There are huge opportunities to use the climate crisis as an opportunity to make health better. For example, why do we have so-called natural gas stoves in our houses that, according to the research we've seen, increases at least 30% the risk of childhood asthma? It pollutes the indoor air. We don't need to do that anymore. There are better electric induction stoves available that also don't heat up your kitchen in the summers. You don't then have to air condition away the heat you've just put in. We pay attention to the impacts of cars. Air pollution is one of them. Yeah, absolutely, huge impact. Climate pollution, huge impact, but also just noise and crashes, the number of people they kill and maim every year. We are sort of used to it, but it's not good. And if we take advantage of this moment to rethink, why do we live like this? Because we don't have to. And we can see other cities around the world, Barcelona, Copenhagen, Paris, who've seized that moment and say, you know what? The city is a much more lovely place to live in if the roads aren't just sewers for cars. So we can, in fact, make so many things better. Another point that we make in our plan is to look at where does the worst pollution come from. And it's interesting, actually, that the pre-2008 diesel vehicles have a totally disproportionate adverse impact on health, and especially in people in lower income communities that tend to have the busiest roads. Getting those things off the road right away, which we would do, will have a noticeable impact on human health fast. There's just no reason to have those things still on the road or in construction sites. And that includes the old buses as well. Getting them switched out for electric buses, cleaner, quieter, less vibration, more pleasant to ride in. Don't pump out dirty pollution to the people behind. So many things we can make better at the same time.
Great. Thank you very much. And you brought up the issue of social justice, which dovetails nicely into my fourth question. The opportunities, the burdens that come from a transition away from a carbon economy are not going to fall evenly if we just let them fall as they will. Who are you concerned about? And what are your plans for a just transition? For this question, I'll let Diane go first, followed by Peter and then Katie. Diane, you have 2 minutes, please.
Dan, who needs climate action the most? It's the most vulnerable, because climate chaos hurts them the most. So let's start with Indigenous people. As I reported to the legislature years ago, environmental justice has to be part of our reconciliation with Indigenous people. And that's why our plan includes, as I mentioned, $1 billion for Indigenous climate leadership. In fact, we've got a long list of steps that we would take to respect and engage and follow the lead of Indigenous communities, and especially in renewable energy and Indigenous protected and conserved areas. The second thing we have to think about is how can young people find a path into the green economy? So many of them want to and just can't get there. So a just transition in action, well, that's our 60,000 people's a year of free college tuition in green employment and a guaranteed year of employment, so that after that they are ready to walk straight into the green economy, and we know that the employers need them. A third thing is to focus enhancing low-income communities. So 25% of the benefits of our roadmap to net zero are dedicated to improving the lives of low-income communities. And that includes things like green space, extensive retrofits of social housing, which generally was built cheaply and badly and is miserable to live in, bus lanes and bike lanes. Dedicated bus lanes can make really good transit very cheaply, very quickly, 10, 20 years faster than digging a hole in the ground for a subway. And especially if you use electric buses, it can be a really high quality way to get around for everybody. So we can do all those things. Clean is awesome. Why should it just be for the rich? It doesn't have to be.
Thank you very much. That's great. Peter, please go ahead.
Thanks, Dan. Good question. I would say that there's no doubt in this society, people low income, women, people who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, they are all the most vulnerable to the disruption and the physical impacts of the climate crisis. We certainly saw with the impact of COVID that those communities were most heavily hit. And I would say women in every group were most heavily hit. We're going to have to, I think, be very conscious as we expand the workforce to develop the green economy, to recruit within those communities so people have an opportunity to access highly paid, highly skilled jobs. We have to be looking at those people who are working in industries that will be disrupted by the transition, both because they did nothing wrong, they're just trying to make a living. They need to have support and they need to have a job forward path that will allow them to stabilize their lives. No question about it. One of the things that we have in our climate plan is the expansion of funding for PSWs and childcare workers, because the reality is that women far too often are the ones responsible for looking after parents and looking after children. If you're going to make space for them to get into new careers, those sorts of caring professional opportunities have to be expanded so that they aren't in a situation where having to look after a child or an elderly parent is keeping them back from the workforce. The one other thing I want to mention here is that we have to make it easier for people to unionize. Working people do better in societies where they have the opportunity to unionize and bargain for better pay, benefits, working conditions. And I think that has to be part of the social justice component of any transition. We have an opportunity here, not just to make a transition in our technology, but in the way our society is shaped. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks very much. Katie, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think part of the problem is that in any crisis, those who are already vulnerable in a system are most at risk. And certainly we saw that clearly in the current COVID-19 crisis, where infection and hospitalization rates were much higher for racialized Ontarians and for low-income Ontarians. And so unless we take strong action on climate, we know that racialized and low-income and marginalized Ontarians will bear the brunt of the negative impacts of climate, even though realistically they are the least responsible for getting us into this position. So I think, we know that acting on climate is going to mean a huge transition. I mean, we're trying to, change our society and our entire economy in the next few years. It's no small undertaking. And so I think that transition is also a time where we need to make sure that we use it as an opportunity to make it a just transition and to make sure that those who are already, realistically, they're not just vulnerable to the climate effects, they're people who are already underserved by the status quo. And so in this time of transition, when we're changing the status quo, this is a time to make sure that they are, given more support and given a place in this new economy, this new society that we're going to be creating over the next few years. So we do have many things in our plan that get at a just transition. We have some funding dedicated towards retrofits for low-income folks for their homes. Again, not only does that get at emissions, it makes it cheaper for them to heat and cool their houses. We have a lot in there around helping to electrify rural and northern communities to help get them off diesel, which is so essential. And we also have a big green jobs plan as well that is going to be key for getting a lot of these people into this clean economy and helping them get a good green job.
Dan, you're muted.
I just said with my microphone muted that things were about to get interesting. That was a very meta thing to have happen because that in itself was an interesting mistake I made. All right, so what I'd like to do now is sorry, I've still got a warning that I'm muted. We've covered a lot of issues this evening, and maybe if you're in the audience, the participants have already addressed the questions that you came in with. So I want to know now, as a viewer of the debate, now that you've had your brain tickled a little bit and you've thought a little bit about some of these issues that have been brought up, I want to know what you're wondering about. So we're going to use the Mentimeter again here now. What we're going to do is we're going to post another link in the chat here. This is a new Mentimeter link. And you can go ahead and you can go to menti.com and use this code. And I want to know what's on your mind now. Maybe it's transit, maybe it's the economy, renewables, vaccine research, misinformation. It could be anything. As we said, the environment touches on a lot of topics. So here, there's the link in the chat now. So you can use that, or you can go to menti.com and use that code. I'll let this populate for a moment. So again, this is happening live. If you're attending this debate and you're on your computer, you can help push words onto that screen, which I'm going to use to drive the questions going forward here. Seeing protecting water, environmental racism, plastics, active transportation, incentives, housing, Indigenous knowledge, still a few answers coming in. I see people posting their words to the chat. That's not going to populate them into this Mentimeter system. So if you want your input to show up here on this screen that we're all looking at here, this white screen with the colored words, you need to use that link, which is that menti.com link, or you can just go to the main webpage, www.menti.com, and then punch in that 8-digit code. Which seems like more work, but it actually works pretty fast. And I'll just give this another minute or so. I've already got a good number of responses. And again, if they're larger, it means that it was a more popular answer. And we've got a couple that just sort of sit in the middle and aren't moving around as much as the ones around. So let's start with the most popular one. It looks like protecting water and housing are right neck and neck, but protecting water seem to be bigger when I looked at it first. So we'll go there. So protecting water, I'm going to let each of you sort of talk about your position and your party's position on protecting water. It's going to go Diane first, then Peter, then Katie. So Diane, please go right ahead and tell us your positions on protecting water in Ontario.
Well, we absolutely have to protect water. Water is life, and it is almost literally insane that we put so much filth in it. I mentioned my last reports just before my office was abolished. One of the things that I did look at was the fouling of water in Ontario, which included 1,760 combined sewer overflows in the previous year, and that's filth of every conceivable kind going into our water year after year after year. So you'll see that in our plan, we look at every possible aspect of how we protect water, fixing our water taking system, getting much more serious about water pollution, getting back to the promise that the old parties made 40 years ago that we would virtually eliminate persistent toxics in water, paying attention to phosphorus runoff and agricultural runoff, which is badly contaminating water everywhere. We've got to get serious about road salt, which makes the water poisonous to the creatures that live in it. We need to think about temperature of water, because when water gets warmer, it holds less oxygen and the fish suffocate. So we need to pay attention to water at every possible level. And you'll see there's an entire section in our plan. The second pillar of our roadmap is protecting water and nature. We also need to charge more for water, frankly, because we have an enormous amount of waste in Ontario. It's just extraordinary how much treated water we take and waste. And we don't have to. That's through leaks. It's through lack of water meters. It's through bad irrigation practices, all kinds of things. So we have many opportunities. I did a whole report on the energy footprint of water use in Ontario called Every Drop Counts, and I would recommend that to people. It's on my website. And it's still the last word on what we need to do. There are so many opportunities, and the urgency gets greater every year. You're still on mute, Dan.
Apologies for that. Peter, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Dan. I guess there are a number of things that I want to address, and I want to start off by noting that one of the things that we absolutely have to do as a signal to people across Ontario, but also I think as a matter of justice, is clean up the mercury in the English Wabigoon River system and ensure that funding is there for the people who've suffered from mercury poisoning in the Grassy Narrows First Nation. That's sort of an open sore here in Ontario. And I think the approach of both cleaning up and preventing further pollution is going to be critical to ensuring that we have water that we can drink, water that's safe. But we also need to look at all of our source water protection plans and making sure that every area where we are drawing water is an area that we are examining, assessing both for inflows and outflows so that we have clean drinkable water for the future. And frankly, I should not forget to mention that we have to make sure that every community in this province, and I'm talking particularly about First Nations, have access to clean, safe water, but they're not under boil water advisories. We need an inventory of water use in Ontario as a whole, and we need to be ensuring that communities have the water they need for planned growth. As we increase density in our cities, in our towns, we're going to have to make sure that people have the water that they need. And so we need long-term water planning, both in terms of our larger ecosystems, but also in terms of our urban areas. And with that, Dan, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. And I will take it unmuted, no less. Katie, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there's no question that our fresh water is an incredible resource in Ontario, and it's something that needs to be protected. And with a resource that vast, there is no reason that any Ontarian should not have access to clean drinking water. So some of the things that we would do to protect the drinking water. So I've already mentioned our plan of protecting 30% of Ontario. And a big part of that plan and how we plan to pick where those areas are going to be is around focusing on using those protected areas to protect our drinking water and working closely with Indigenous communities to find the right places to protect. There's also part of our plan focuses on cleaning up some of those existing contaminated sites where water is contaminated and focusing on cleaning up that contamination. Our plan also includes strengthening conservation authorities. So this is, of course, one of the things that the Ford government has done, has really cut the powers of conservation authorities. We're going to bring that back, give them more funding and broader authority to protect water. And then lastly, we're also going to look at, how do we, in terms of, municipal drinking water and keeping it to a high standard, how do we make sure that it is, keeping up to date with some of the newer toxins, things like microplastics. So our plan involves looking at that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. So Anne-Marie, I'll ask you to please pull that word cloud back up onto the screen, if you would be so kind. I'll hope I haven't caught you. Oh, there we go. Great. So let's all have a look at that screen. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to invite our panelists to just draw what they want from that and speak for a couple minutes about what jumps out at them from what they see there. And really, it's totally up to you which of these topics you want to address. And I will do this. Let's see. I'll start with Peter, and then I'll go to Katie, and then Diane. I'll give you 2 minutes to go ahead and speak to the issues that the participants at our event here have brought forward and address those directly. Please go ahead, Peter.
Okay, Dan, thank you. And I think there are two that have pretty large indicators here: environmental racism and housing. And I think the reality in Ontario is that if you're not white, it's far more likely that you're poor, that you're in an area that's exposed to emissions. When I canvass through my writing, and my guess is people find it in others, I find far more Black families and Southeast Asian families on main streets and far less often in the side streets. So I think addressing the overall racism problem we have in our society so that people of color, Black people, are able to earn higher incomes and are able to live in places that are less problematic environmentally is a consequence. And obviously the other side of it, because we don't want anyone exposed to toxic chemicals or poisonous air, is cleaning up our transportation system so that we don't have internal combustion dominating our transportation and polluting our sidewalks and our roadways. The other item here that's really big is housing. And I'm not surprised, because I've been finding that people are very worried about the housing situation they're facing right now, not just in this city, but across Ontario. I think that as part of the process of changing our society to deal with the environmental crisis, the climate crisis, we're going to have to provide an awful lot more housing. All of us touched on that earlier. We need to densify our cities. We need to avoid sprawl. We need to make sure that people are comfortable living in cities, in basement apartments, and duplexes and triplexes. That not only solves the environmental problem by reducing energy need, but it also increases people's opportunities to have the housing that they require to live decent lives. Back to you, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, I don't know that you can see my paper under this screen view, so I thank you for stopping. I'll let you go ahead, Katie, for 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think when I look at this, the first thing that comes to mind is interconnected, and just how interconnected all of these issues are. And I think that, you know, at first that can seem very overwhelming, that it's, you know, all these different layers of challenges and crises that overwhelm. But the exciting thing for me about how they all interact is that it means that solutions, for one, can help solve many of these problems at once if we're smart about it. And so I think that's really what we need to look at. You know, obviously environmental racism is a big one that comes up here. There's no doubt that racialized communities often live closer to polluting industry and pollution. And so as we deal with, you know, reducing pollution and put stronger restrictions on industry's ability to pollute, we're also going to be predominantly helping those communities in dealing with that environmental racism. You know, I see housing and active transportation that jump out at me. And I think that comes back to that idea that it's not just about planning housing, we need to actually plan communities, right? And even that, it's not just transportation, it's how do we actually plan smart communities where, you know, people do have that housing, that density of housing, which also makes it feasible that you have all the services that you need close to you. So then you no longer have to have a car. And then how do you ensure that you have that active transportation infrastructure to make it easy for people to cycle and to walk? So I think, you know, that's what really jumps out at me, is how interconnected all of these are, and how if we're smart and strategic in how we prioritize the solutions, we can, you know, get at addressing more than one of these at a time, which is what we need to do, because people need solutions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you so much. Diane, please go ahead.
Well, I agree with my colleagues. This is an impressively large list, and it illustrates, I think, a couple of things. The first is sometimes people are dismissive, saying that focusing on climate or environment is a narrow issue. It's not. A climate and environment lens gives us the trigger, the opportunity to address almost all of the things that are on this sheet, and the urgency to do so. One of the differences between certainly our party and the NDP plan, I can't comment on the Liberal plan for obvious reasons, is that the scale is different. I mean, we're all talking about dealing with, virtually all these things, but we would do it at a much larger scale and more quickly, because to us, the urgency of trying to stay ahead of the climate crisis is primary. And that means we would be moving much more rapidly to deal with almost all of these issues. It's actually really interesting to me how many of these word cloud items are in either our roadmap to net zero, which is our climate and environmental platform, or our housing policy, which the Toronto Star recognized was the best of all the parties. So we do know that these things are intimately related and have to be addressed together. We're not going to be able to withstand the hammer blows of climate change if we don't have housing for the population. We know we're going to have much more immigration into Canada as more and more places elsewhere in the world become uninhabitable and people get chased off their traditional lands. And we also know that if we don't deal with mental health, we're going to have much more burden again on the healthcare system, which itself is going to be much more burdened as climate change accelerates. So looking at these problems as a whole, as opposed to in silos, gives us more opportunities to make more of an impact more quickly and to save more things at the same time. It's too late to just do one thing at a time. We've got too many problems and too little time and too few resources. But once we look at the larger issues together, there are so many opportunities, and we could start them right now.
Thank you, Diane. Appreciate your thoughts there. I'm going to now take we've been going through the chat and looking at different things that have come up there. And there's an overarching sort of theme that comes up about hope. And this is something that I see all the time as a science journalist, is that it's very easy for people to get turned off of environmental problems and challenges if they don't feel a sense of hope. So let me ask it the way it was posted in the chat, which is, the issue of climate-induced anxiety has come up. Is there any reason for confidence about our future on this planet? Where do we find reason to be confident? Katie first, then Diane, then Peter. Go ahead, Katie, please.
Oh boy, and is it 2 minutes for this one too?
It is 2 minutes, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Wow, what a question. I mean, first, I find for me, I have to choose hope. As a parent with a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, hope is the only option, right? And so hope means doing whatever I can to fight for a better future for them. And that's why I'm running for office. That's why I'm up here doing this debate with you instead of putting them to bed downstairs, because I think this is essential. And I think we need more people who are concerned about climate to actually jump in and get political and run for office. I think that's what it's going to take to change things. So that's why I'm here. But I will say, I do feel a lot of hope. I have been helping the party, put together the climate and environment plan that is coming soon. And, one of the things that we've been doing is meeting with so many stakeholders, so many environmental groups over the past few months. And what is so striking is that we are at a moment in time where we have all the solutions. We have them and they're right there. They're just waiting to be implemented. And not only do we have the solutions, but like we've already discussed, so many of the solutions have other benefits. So it's not even, I feel like what's so frustrating to me about the Ford government and their approach is that they're still perpetuating this old idea that it is the environment versus the economy, or that we have to sacrifice something in order to take climate action. And that just could not be further from the truth based on where we are. Every solution that we have comes with other benefits. Who doesn't want more, who doesn't want walkable communities? Who doesn't want, more housing? Who doesn't want more parks and more protected areas? Who doesn't want to have a more efficient home that is more comfortable and cheaper to heat and cool? So all of the climate actions have other benefits, and so it's all right there. We just need to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Diane, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dan. Dan, you may not know, the very last question I ask every single guest on my podcast, Green Economy Heroes, is, do you have hope? And that's why I'm doing the podcast, is to talk to green business leaders across Canada who are making a living and creating employment, reducing our carbon footprint. And talking to them is part of how I keep going, because I've done more than 70 episodes so far. I didn't know that I'd get more than a couple of dozen, to be honest. Companies right across the country, men, women, people of all kinds of backgrounds, every corner of the country, who are finding a different way to reduce our carbon footprint. They need government leadership. They need better infrastructure, better rules in order to scale up. But there are so many smart, passionate people working day in and day out to give us a better future. And I mean, like Katie, that's why I'm still working on this. I mean, there are two ways of thinking about hope. One is to say it's a probabilistic thing. You know, probably everything is going to be okay. I don't have that hope anymore. We threw that away. But the other kind of hope is a kind of courage, where you get up in the morning and we work for a better future, because the chance is better than zero that we can still turn this around. If we give up, it'll be zero. If we don't give up, we might still be able to pull this off. There isn't much time, but we know what to do. We have the solutions, we have the tools. We just have to do it.
Thank you very much. Peter, please go ahead.
Thanks, Dan. Like my colleagues, I have hope that we actually can prevail. I have confidence that we have the ability, that we have the tools, that we have the will to actually save ourselves and build a new future. We've already seen a huge drop in the cost of technologies like solar and wind that are part of the solution. We've seen beyond the technologies, though, the growth of the global climate movement, youth-led, that I think has reshaped politics on this planet. COVID has certainly been a setback, but it hasn't ended that movement. And I expect that that movement will come back stronger than ever in the next few years. And in line with that movement, I've seen a change in popular consciousness, that many more people than before understand the challenge that we're facing and are willing to support action to actually take on that challenge. So you've got people in motion, people understanding, and you've got the tools at hand to actually take it on. There is no such thing as a guaranteed outcome, but in fact, we do have real opportunities here and real chances to make a difference. I have to say, every risk embodies an opportunity, and we face great risk with the climate crisis, but we have, at the same time, this opportunity to reshape the relationships, the power and the politics within our societies to be far more just, far more equal and equitable than we've seen in decades. World War II was an extraordinarily dark and horrible period in our human history. But out of that came a growth in human potential, in democracy in the Western countries that was extraordinary. A real building of the economy, development of education, a flowering of understanding that I think we can see as we fight this climate crisis.
Well, thank you so much. All three of your answers gave me great hope. And so I think in that spirit, I want to thank each of you, Peter, Katie, and Diane, for participating in the event tonight. And I want to give each of you the opportunity to make some concluding remarks, 2 minutes each, just to leave this audience with a taste of where you want to leave them and what lasting impression you want to leave with them. Peter, I'm going to start with you here, then I'll go to Katie, and then finally Diane. Peter, please go ahead. You have 2 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Well, first of all, I have to say this has been a really good session. I want to thank RNAO and Kate for hosting this debate and for inviting me because it's been quite informative. Dan, you've been a great moderator. You are excellent at holding up pieces of paper and something you should develop in the future. I want to thank my colleagues, Diane Sachs and Katie Gibbs, for representing their parties this evening. Let's face it, democracy depends on free exchange of ideas and vigorous but respectful debate. And I think the three of us made that happen this evening. So to my colleagues on this debate, my thanks. The climate crisis is not a future event. It's happening now, people are losing their lives and they're losing their livelihoods. They're losing them in wildfires and floods. They're losing lives to air pollution. They're losing their lives or losing their health to new diseases like Lyme. And frankly, we're seeing around the world an expansion of military conflicts with fight over resources. This is a very difficult and perilous time for humanity. And I think for all of us, our goal has to be to act quickly to prevent acceleration of the conditions that put people at risk. We are going to see novel conditions. You were talking about Lytton earlier, Dan, the heat bomb that had that impact on that community. We are also going to see an impact on our healthcare system that will reduce the level of care that we need. And that's going to require a all of society approach to change conditions so that we can have decent lives. What we face here, as I said in my response to the question on hope, is great risk and great opportunity. And I think if we do it right, the climate crisis can take us to a more equitable society, a society where historic injustices around class, around gender, around race, and other factors can be addressed and people supported to live much better lives. If we get it wrong, then much greater misery, much more conflict. I look forward to competing with and cooperating with my colleagues in the years to come. Thanks very much, Dan.
Thank you very much. And Katie, you have 2 minutes. Please go ahead.
Yeah, well, first, again, a big thank you to the organizers for hosting this. I do really think that climate has to be a main issue that we discuss going into the election. Often, even when it seems like climate is going to be an election issue, once you get in there, it sometimes seems like other issues kind of compete for attention. So I think it's so important that we had this debate tonight. I'm always thrilled to talk with anyone, and especially, my colleagues from other parties about climate solutions. And I think it is great to see that there is a lot of overlap in what we want to see, and so that is great. I can tell you that we will have an ambitious plan. I had hoped it would be out by now. It's not, but I can tell you that it is coming very soon. It's going to be ambitious, but also feasible. Like I said, it is costed, it is modeled. We are serious about climate action. As the IPCC report said, this is a now or never moment. We are on a very short timeline to make a big amount of change. So you need to also look at the platforms, not just with an eye to, what are the goals, what are they promising, but are the details there, and do you think that they can deliver on them? And I know, there were some comments on the Liberal record, and of course it is a debate, but I think I do need to talk a little bit about the Liberal record on climate. Realistically, we are the only party here that has a record of actually implementing some big, bold climate action that did bring in some huge reductions in CO2 emissions, with eliminating the coal-fired power plants, of course, and then also doing things like bringing in the green belt protection. And so I think we have that history of bold climate action, and I'm excited for the plan to come out, and you can see on how we're going to build on that previous bold climate action going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And Diane, you have the last word.
Thank you, Dan. Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight and everyone who participated. Elections matter, and you do have an important choice to make. It sounds a little bit as we all chat, and we all do care about climate, that there's not that much difference between the parties, but there really, really is. If you don't want to live in a don't look up world where people pretend we don't have to do much until it's too late, if you want to stand up for real action now and what matters most, then you can make a new choice. And go back to my 3 key points. What are the 3 things we have to have in a climate plan that is consistent with science? We've got to have a fair share carbon budget that looks at our total pollution, not just what year we're going to say we're going to stop. We have to have a really serious carbon price, and we're the only one that does. And we have to double our electricity system with clean, renewable power so that we can electrify everything else. And again, we're the only one that does. You know that climate chaos is the greatest threat to our future, and that the new climate economy is the greatest opportunity. And besides, the new climate economy is inevitable. Physics will not compromise. The cost will soar, the suffering will soar. The real risk isn't from taking action. The real risk is from dragging our feet and taking half measures and tweaks and thinking that that'll be enough. Instead of wasting billions of dollars repeating last century mistakes like highways, let's get ready for Ontario to be a winner in the new economy. And we can do that. We have the technology, we have the know-how to get off fossil fuels and keep billions of dollars in Ontario. We're lucky in our geography, we're lucky in our resources, we're very lucky in our people. We have a solid plan and our roadmap, and we still have a small window to make it happen. What we don't have is political will. And despite Peter and Katie and the wonderful things they've said tonight, the old line party leaders don't have it. And that's why so many voters tell me at the door they're ready to vote Green. Every voice at Queen's Park matters, and Greens punch way above our weight. Climate urgency can be the trigger to make so much better. Send more Green MPPs to Queen's Park to speak up for the future you want. There's no more time to waste.
Thank you, Diane. That concludes our evening. I want to thank our debate participants for their thoughtful responses this evening, and with my thanks to those in the audience who watched and participated in the evening tonight, I'm going to turn it over to Millie Roy, Chair of the Ontario Chapter of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, to give some closing thoughts.
Thank you so much, Dan. And I'm so pleased to say a few words on behalf of Cape Ontario as a co-host of tonight's program. I'd like to start by thanking each candidate and our moderator for giving of your time and expertise, and to everyone in the audience who engaged in today's debate. Thanks to everyone who helped with organizing. And I want to give an extra special thanks to our lead organizer, the incredibly capable Matt Kelway of RNAO, who has worked on this project tirelessly on the tightest of timelines and put it together flawlessly. Healthy debate is integral to a healthy democracy. And those of you who participated today as candidates are supporting this cornerstone of democracy. So as voters, your presence does matter to us. And let's reflect for a moment on why, with this province-wide debate, we did choose to focus on the environment. The IPCC makes it clear we are on a path to uncontrolled climate crisis, and has declared code red for humanity. We've heard insights, excellent insights from our candidates tonight as to how issues related to the environment and climate are tightly interwoven with so many other critically important issues, and ranging from housing, food security, transportation and energy use, to the economy and health and equity, some of the most important facets of our lives. We hope today's debate will help to inform voters of the essential role of the environment in every facet of our lives, and thereby elevate it to be the leading issue of the upcoming provincial election. And the latest IPCC report, I quote, states that effective and equitable climate governance builds on engagement with civil society actors, political actors, businesses, youth, labor, media, Indigenous peoples, and local communities, end quote. And it also clearly recognizes, as we've heard tonight, that our window to act on climate is closing rapidly. If we measure this in election cycles, we have barely 2 full election cycles left. So the next government holds a responsibility unlike anything that has ever come before. There's never been more at stake, and we as voters must choose our government wisely and continue to hold that government accountable in safeguarding our well-being by safeguarding the environment. So in Ontario, we must have that government now, must have them rise above partisan politics and do what needs to be done to implement all the solutions we already have on hand. And that is our only way forward, through collective action, with every last one of us working together to preserve today and tomorrow. And I think we heard about the question of hope, and I truly feel that this is where our hope comes from. So thank you to everybody who turned out, and let's hope for a good outcome from the election. Thank you and good night.
Good night, everybody, and thank you for running.